I am so mellow yellow, Buddha sings
Yeah,
in
I
my
was Jap,
veins.
but not that kind, the kind all good and smart and perfect with the Japan pencil case, leather saddle bag.
I want to write a
Smart
poem that the New York Times will not print because it might start some kind of black or
daughters.
lesbian or...
One has a husband and lover. One has two ex-husbands.
People know Vietnam is not a war, but a piece of us, sister. And we are so
It is
much
our heritage, a ritual meal, a feast for the spirit.
Writing as an Asian American woman at the end of this century is really quite different because Asian American women didn't really have a voice at the beginning of the century.
When I grew up, I hardly ever, of course, there were no Asian Americans writing. You know, I had no role models as a young person. And so I realized how important it is for future generations to see themselves, you know, see their own images reflected in the literature that they read.
When I was growing up, I had issues. You know, I had an Asian father who wasn't claiming me. I had a mother who was disappearing, had disappeared actually. My mother was gone. I don't have any early memories of my mother.
And in my longing for this place I still call home, I forget that every time I am successful in this art, my Asian father is embarrassed. For with this craft, I tell stories. Some true, some not so true. And before his oriental lips can form the phrase drunk or blow nose, everybody finds out that the very upper class and married Chinese gentleman crossed the lines, went over to commune to break more than bread with a tall black girl from the lower side of Montego Bay. The child is still here to prove it, shaming everybody but the grandmother, and only because she can't hear what her granddaughter writing about. In the whitewashed silence of this uprooted urban life, I cannot find the place to hang this hat of mine cut rough from the green of the Jamaican flag, the yellow, striped, thick and woolen to warm me in the wintertime, stained black with the secrets of my birth, smelling of the places I have been, and filled with the dreams of the places I still want to go. On some days, I want to hang it in a room, my grandmother calling my name, the soft murmur of old women praying for my mother who ran away to Canada when my father denied I was his. But in such a place, I would be afraid because my woman could only come in secret for me there. But mostly, I fear I would not have the courage to write, and I want to write more than I want to live.
I am asking myself if I am half Asian and if I wasn't raised in an Asian home, does that still make me Asian? I mean, if I'm not culturally Asian, is there something else in me that's Asian? And I mean, I have hair that's black hair, and my features don't necessarily say Chinese upon sight. And I wonder about that. But here in America, there has been more reason to question it. There has been more reason to question a lot more about myself. Being Asian, being lesbian, being Caribbean, being black. Because the writing demands that you question who you are and what you stand for.
My father's grandfather came to the United States in the mid-1800s, I believe, as a treaty merchant under the Treaty Merchants Act. On my mother's side of the family, my mother's grandfather came to Jamaica as a contract laborer after the Emancipation Act.
On my mother's side, her parents were both born in Hiroshima Prefecture in Japan, and they came to the United States, Hawaii, as laborers.
My father's father came to the island of Kauai as a contract worker for the sugar plantation in 1917. And my grandmother was already working as a maid in Lihui, Kauai.
My grandmother on my Korean side of the family was a picture bride, and she and my grandfather worked in the sugarcane plantations of Hawaii.
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1954 and grew up near Akron, Ohio.
My father was the first to come over, and he came over in 1965 along with my two sisters. I was born in New York on the Lower East Side in 1968.
I was born in China, in Beijing in 1947, and I grew up on the West Coast and then in Massachusetts.
I was born in Hong Kong. I was raised in Portland, Oregon. I came here when I was 7.
Came to the States when I was 9 years old in that wave of late 60s immigration of professional families from Korea to the United States. I guess my most distinct sensation about that is arriving in the middle of a very small town in Oklahoma.
Coming to the United States was a sensory shock for me. Coming from this lush tropical landscape to Boston in 1969, at the height of the anti-Vietnam protests, for example, I felt very much displaced, dislocated. The cold was an amazing and very painful experience for me.
I was born in 1956 in Calcutta. I came to the United States in 1976 to continue my graduate education in English literature.
I was born in Shanghai, 1957. In 1966, I was in the 3rd grade. The Cultural Revolution began, and all the schools stopped. And I practically taught myself by reading all kinds of books I could grab. You know, books were completely forbidden except for mouse books. So when I graduated from high school, which is kind of practically a joke at the time, you know, I went to the countryside. The reason actually was that's the only way I could go to college, and I was very determined that I had to go to college, you know. So I went to the countryside, became a peasant, which is like you go to the bottom of the society. Then I went to Hangzhou to study English. Then I went to Beijing University. Then after I graduated, I taught there for a year. Then I came here in 1985. So just like this, out of the plane at Kennedy, destination, Flushing address, no sense of direction. What? A quarter for the payphone? No, all her luggage, $25 and a dictionary. First night in basement, sleepless, indigestion of dreams, want to scream but no. Her sponsor upstairs, silent night, staring into space, no sense of direction, hover between awareness and loss. First month working to pay off the plane ticket, selling Chinese antiques, Fifth Avenue, leaves falling on the homeless blanket, on the golden canopy of the store, 2 worlds, pizza for lunch, on the bus, first bite of cheese, throwing up on the boss shoes, no sense of value, no brain for business, too stubborn to be a running dog, out of the store, out of the basement, out hunting for jobs, 2 restaurants, Flushing for weekend, Midtown from Monday to Friday, first apartment room in Bay Ridge, $180 for rent, 4 hours underground, reading Ulysses in train, all dozing, rocking like a cradle, mother rocker, sleeping in class, sorry Shakespeare, tender mercies, full-time school or get out of America, lost in Times Square, someone give me a quarter please, no sense of direction. I came here with a lot of hope, even though I knew I had to struggle very hard. But then when I came here, I felt this, you know, New York is a very intense city, also a very tense city. I felt that intensity here and the coming fight, you know, and I was very nervous. The first 8 months, actually, I moved 10 times because I had no money. And I was fired constantly. I was working as a waitress in restaurants. I had to go to full-time. And and I hadn't discovered writing yet at that time. So I was, in a way, it's like a lost soul. When I was in China, there was always America to look forward to, that I can go there someday. When I finally came here, then where else can I go? I don't know. You know, I knew that I was going to school, then I knew I would get a PhD someday, but I knew that I wouldn't be happy just being a teacher. and just be an academic, professor. And I didn't know what else I could do, So in that sense, I found my second life. This writing is my life. It's really important.
I was born in 1972 in a small coastal town in southern Vietnam called Phan Thiet. And I grew up there until I was about 6, and then my father and I escaped by boat. When I left Vietnam, I think of that as the beginning of queerness, of having to navigate between where you were and wherever you will be. We left at night, and it was very chaotic, and I woke up the next morning with my father, and my mother wasn't there. That sort of defined my time at sea. We were in a fishing boat, and we were passed by a number of commercial fishing ships. And we were picked up by an American naval ship and taken to Singapore. And I remember being on my dad's back and my dad climbing up from the boat into the naval ship. And I remember looking back at the boat from the ship and just seeing how small it was, and just the ship was just so big and grand and another world entirely. And then I remember being at the refugee camp and being introduced to Coca-Cola and all of that. I think what it taught me, or the biggest thing that it taught me, was this sense of going out and not knowing where you would end up, and that you had to go anyway. And my dad was very insistent with me that I understand that we could never go back. I was taught to be very grateful for surviving that journey. At the same time, I think that because I was taught to be so grateful, I wasn't allowed to say at times that I wasn't sure I wanted to go in the first place. When I was in Vietnam, I had an older sister who was called Big Girl, and I was the youngest girl, and I was called Little Girl. And her formal name was Thuy, and my formal name was Giang. But in our family, we were just called by our nicknames, which were Big Girl and Little Girl. And then when my dad and I were in Singapore, he had to fill out a form saying what my name was, and he wrote down that my name was Thuy, right? 2 years later, my mother comes over and she says, no, that's wrong. Her name is Giang, and that the older daughter's name was Thuy. But my older sister had drowned at a refugee camp in Malaysia, so my mother told me that I had to keep her name. Wearing her dress like I wear her name. Don't you know, sweat makes it mine. It means I'm here and living. When it was yours, you drenched it in ocean water, soaked it wet with your death. Ma had to keep it in the silky compartment of her suitcase, folded small and tight like a secret, and like a secret, it never dried. If I hadn't dragged this dress out of the attic, it would have spilled out. And me, the biggest girl now that you're gone, I would have had to swish you round the floor until everything you spilled was soaked dry by this dress. Isn't it better I dry it on my body, each drop of sweat pushing back the waves, so that when I'm the age you left dying, I will have pushed the entire ocean out and gone leaping across it, both legs kicking in the air, the way we used to leap over jump ropes, running to meet on the other side. It didn't even touch me, we'd say.
I'm quite sure that the reason that I'm a poet is because I started in one language, and then, at some developmental stage was shifted suddenly, and so I think my whole experience of life is of something that's relative, you know, there's this, and then there was a language, and there's a new language, and everything from one can relate to another or be equivalent to another, but there's something lost. And I think that's really a foundation of my emotional foundation of my poetry.
The draw and push toward language definitely for me resides in that uncertainty between languages, the act of going from one language to another language. So whatever the primary actors are, whether it's a Korean or an English, it's really the crossing between those spaces and trying to understand the complexity of that has brought me to poetry.
I'm very interested in the question of whether you can speak a language right or wrong. And I feel that because English is a living language, it is sort of shaped by anyone who speaks it. It's shaped by the people who speak it. And so whatever accents and inflections and ways that people choose to use English will make an impression on English as we know it, and on what is English in terms of writing or speaking.
English is a wonderful language to write in because we have twice as many words as actually some other languages, especially Western languages.
American English, in its multitudinous varieties, is quite free of the very tight British model that I was taught as a young girl.
More and more I'm drawn to figure out how the Korean is a part of that English.
I think of my emotional range almost being experienced more in Vietnamese, but then I'm translating an emotional range that I experience in the Vietnamese language into English.
All of these languages have come into America and are becoming part of the American language.
It's embedded in our institutions. It's an institutional racism that says that we're less than and we are not as good as our cousins who grew up on the mainland because they could speak standard English, and it was all about that. Growing up, right, you just think that you're the stupidest person in the world because you not only speak Pidgin, but when you try to speak a standard form of English, you cannot even erase the inflection. The first generation that spoke Pidgin would be the Native Hawaiians and whalers. So it was a language of commerce, a language of trade. When the sugar planters brought all the different started bringing the ethnic groups in to work as contract labor on the plantations, we're already in the second generation of Pidgin, and it's actually not even Pidgin at that point. The linguists call it Hawaii Creole English. It's a Creole already, but we don't call it a Creole here in Hawaii. We continue to call it Pidgin. Pidgin comes really close to the gut of what you need to say. I mean, if you're going to pull a poem out, to me, my choice was that I couldn't do it in any other way. There was no choice for me, because if I had to say something, I would have to say it in a way that I felt it or I knew it. And I think that's what Pidgin is embedded in, is that whole, my background, how I grew up, how I felt. The other day, my mother took us store, and all us when we are yarn wigs in the car, we still letting the yarn blow out the window because it was so long. But when we was ready for go out, I fast kind pull off my yarn wig. She, man, my better they tease me, boy, then, yeah. My sisters, they so stupid. They wear the yarn wigs in the store. The lady at the soda fountain tell, oh my goodness, so cute, Harriet. Check out. And the lady from the fabric side come running over. Oh, the cute, your daughters. I kind of stayed thinking maybe I should have worn my yarn wig too. The fabric lady tell my mother, you made them. Oh, you're so clever with your hands, and they're so adorable. One sister started bringing her hair in the front and acting like Cher. My other sister put all her hair on one side, start acting like she looking for split ends, then her too go fling her hair back. Me, I order my vanilla Coke, and I look at myself in the soda fountain mirror. I see my sisters drag my mother by yellow and orange yarn for make like Bewitched and Lucy. I don't look at myself no more. I pull my bangs real hard with both hands and start feeling real bolo head.
I really believe that there is a kind of woman's language, which is not to say that men don't share in some of the, say, attributes. But for so long, women have been historically viewed as being irrational and, of course, having much to do with the body, mainly because of our menstrual cycles and giving birth and so forth. So we're very body-oriented. And also intuitive. I mean, we've been called all those things and viewed as weak because of those things that have been viewed as part of our nature. And I don't know, I'm interested in saying, yeah, I am all those things. And none of those things are a weakness. She became a sink. She became a blind. She became a styrofoam coffee cup. She became a ballpoint pen. She became the breeze through the door's splinters. She became the mother who was at work, at work at home, and at work at the shore, so her children never saw her without a pencil tucked behind her ear. She became the mother who copy edited at a Tony house before marrying and quitting that nonsense. She became the mother who began with her own father, father, father. She became the mother tattooed with versions of virgins. I am one of two daughters, and now as a parent, I have two daughters. And so it's this kind of world of girls that's really important to me. And I think that the more I write, the more my writing is about that world of being a girl child, and that world of becoming a woman and still retaining that girl, but then also being a woman at the same time.
For me, memory is really key. I mean, it's so crucial to my writing, whether it's in poetry or prose. And I could not write if I did not remember, but by the same token, to write a poem is to remember. It is to bear witness. It is to acknowledge something. So that the poem itself becomes a kind of memory. Right from childhood, I lived in more than one country. Always, of course, feeling that I'm Indian, I'm from India, but I actually grew very used to the landscape of Sudan, and I had very dear friends there. And then at 18, I went to England as a student. That's how I got to England. Then, to complicate the story, I came back to India, and I was in India. I started writing my poems in India, publishing them. And then I came to the United States. I have a poem, which I think of as my first American poem, called Hotel Alexandria. And they're breaking down this big apartment building, which was called Alexandria. And there was this old black woman outside on the sidewalk, and she just had all this, she was a bag lady. I didn't know the word. She had all her possessions in a little bag. She was like a refugee from her own life, and she was just kneeling on the sidewalk, back and forth, and I thought, oh my God, this is a poem. I'm 2 weeks old in the city. I have come here by subway. Memory drew me here, the danger of the unlit passage. I knew that the white gulls that crowd the broken walls of the Alexandria Hotel would not cry to me. Yet I had come as if drawn to the ground of my making. A house dismantled, the poor shed to the streets of Manhattan. Alexandria, city of my childhood, where seagulls wheeled over burning waters and I thought them angels, where old couples, Muslim and Copt, carried out their bedding and laid it to sun, where children cracked sesame seeds in their teeth and laughed at the gulls that hovered over Farouk's abandoned palace. Alexandria, where tongues of water rose and kissed my face. Let me speak now in this cold air of the blisters of birth, my voice imprecise, my ignorance that of a perpetual immigrant, a woman with nowhere to lay her head.
I mean, I am a Korean woman, poet, sort of oddly immigrant. I mean, sort of and sort of not, because I was so young. But by the status of my strange and odd relationship to the language, to the culture, to the history, to an imagined and a sort of impossibly imagined Korea at this point, I am those categories. How I experience the meaning of being Korean, the meaning of being, a gendered person, the meaning of being someone who really has a memory which is not fixed. I mean, that memory is always, in some sense, shifting under you. Is distance, if she knows it, casting and again casting into the pond to hook the same turtle, beset by borders, conquered, disfigured. One house can be seen, then another thatched roof. On this side of the sea, the rancor of their arrival, where invasion occurs according to schedule. Evacuees, a singular wave set against stubbled bluffs. Rigor of those who carry households on their backs. Above, victims. Below, Changi, a typical Korean town. In the distance, a 155mm shell has exploded. There's never an answer about what is it to leave a place? What is it to question your own memory of that place? What is it to have this innate connection to a place which you don't live at anymore? How can you keep generating sort of a collective and cultural memory which you know you're very much implicated in and very much spiritually connected to? But meanwhile, it's so frayed. The connections are very frayed. Meanwhile, they're overwhelmingly strong. And so the poem, for me, becomes a way to try to give some contour to all these provisional, competing, difficult, contestatory, generous, poignant, ridiculous, notions of home, war, how do you tell a story?
Memory is big in my work. But I don't know if I'm talking about memory or if I'm using memory as a metaphor for something else. It's not really memory in the poems. It's more like the fog, where it's a perceptual cloud that can go in and out of focus and change. And by that I must mean that who I am is like that. They counted her more accurate and more inaccurate memories as black and white stones. The more accurate memories turned out to be white on the outside, but they were unconditioned by the desire to form story out of her memory. Continuing story, the way we wish this space and light to continue. Therefore, we appreciate the fog as the power to make the space continue beyond the single perception into raw material or youth of the body, like a body of light. It dissolves now at the top of her head. Now 5 lights into her heart. Now it dissolves into her body. Her friends dissolve into light They dissolve into her family, which seems to dissolve into clouds that were already full of light. It is not so much the quality or brightness of light or her understanding of this light as the number of times she dissolves. The faster she can dissolve into the space, the better. It is almost as if the complete dark would be ideal. Because fog has so many different manifestations, I could, it gave me a lot of room to describe a lot of different ways that you can know other people or try to communicate or connect with other people.
My father left my mother very early. I was only 8 or 9, and my mother never recovered from his departure. And my poems really address this. My poems yearn for this exalting love that's lacking in my family.
My father died when I was 14, and if you ask me, do I remember writing my first poem in some very striking way, it would have to be that moment, which has, for me, become a kind of living record of both his death and the first poem.
I think really my mother got me most interested in words. She'd make little books, and I'd draw the pictures, and she would type in little stories, and I think I began to understand the value of words and how much words could be fun.
Because my father was an airline pilot, we traveled to many places when I was little, and I guess I wanted to write a journal to chronicle the travels that we did as a family, and that began this long habit of writing down my experiences.
My relationship with my mother in a large way has been an impetus for what I write and why I write it. My family didn't really talk about Vietnam. We didn't have all that many photos, and since I wasn't around to experience her in the prime of her life and haven't received any of it through any of her own tellings directly, and haven't heard about her own experiences through my siblings either, I think a large impetus for my writing about the time period during which she was young is that I know so little of the truth, and so my poems are an exploration of what could be the truth. I obviously know that they're just fictional renderings of situations in which she could have found herself, and frequently I wander far off from where I think she would be, but the essence of her experience and her emotions and the place that she was in, I think, are reflected in the poems. I dream of being alone in this field. It has been years since I have been able to be with my husband at his whim, and now I carry another wish, the result of the banishment of our children to their room. Alone with me, he has nothing to say, and so must touch. We will have 7 come this August.
My father came to this country in about 1907, I think, when he was a young student, to go to school. Then he went to Japan and married my mother, and when he had to become a family person, he got a job as an interpreter in Seattle. And that's where I grew up. The influence of my father as a poet has had a great impact on me. He started a a group called the Senyukai, and they would meet in our house about once a month. And I used to sit and watch the poets. In 1941, at the advent of the war, my father was arrested by the FBI because he was working as in the immigration office in Seattle, and along with a lot of leading men, Japanese men, immigrants there, he was suspected of subversive activities, and so he was taken into custody and spent more than 4 years in the prisoner of war camps, which is different from the internment camps where we went. My family was then evacuated from Seattle, Washington. We were moved to Idaho, and I spent 1.5 years there. And I left to go to work. Essentially, I couldn't get accepted into any college because I was an enemy alien since I was born in Japan. My older brother was accepted at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio. So I left camp with him. You couldn't leave unless you had some sponsorship, and I found a job on the campus, and then eventually I was accepted there. Maybe years later, as I got married, had 4 children, I stayed home and as a mother and a housewife for 15 years. When I really started to become very serious about myself as a poet, what I did was I kind of reached back to having the experience that I had, the kind of things that my father taught me, and that is that you write poetry about your daily cares, about your fears, your concerns, frustrations, and all of these things that you really care about. Why is a soldier boy in a cage like that? In the freedom of the child's universe, the uniformed guard stood trapped in his outside cage. We walked away from the gate and grated guard on sawdusted grounds where millions trod once to view prize cows at the Puyallup Fair. They gave us straws to sleep on, encased in muslin ticks. Some of us were stalled under grandstand seats, the egg with parallel lines. Lines formed for food, lines for showers, lines for the John, lines for shots. My writing about my camp experience, it did become a political act. It was kind of breaking a silence. You know, I have a voice and I have something to say about my particular experience as a woman and as an Asian woman in this country.
While I was in the writer's workshop at the University of Iowa, I went basically through a personal crisis. What I essentially felt was that I needed to live more of my life, and I also needed to face certain existential questions, which kept coming back to me in my work. The gray transformers on the alley's wooden scaffold hunch and grow more dense. At this hour, I no longer hear the nighthawk's scraping cries, and the sky grows grainy and mindless. I have sat up all night convinced that something is being asked to be recovered, that somewhere an old doorway in the earth is opening, releasing what I've lost. And yet, as I reach forward to turn off the lamp, and the room fills with quiet fire, and pigeons scuffle on the windowsill. I don't know. I don't know. I felt I needed to actually make a break from everything that I had done, all of my training, all of my family history, in order to go inwards and address some very basic spiritual questions. I began practicing at this Zen temple in Ann Arbor in 1982. As my practice continued, actually all of the questions that I'd ever had were never answered, but they continued to grow deeper and they continued to grow larger, and I continued to pursue them with ever more passion until at a certain point I decided it seemed to make sense to follow the tradition to its source, and there were programs in Korea. As a Japanese American in Korea, it was an experience for me of multiple displacements and yet a certain sense of feeling very much at home. I could walk around and feel completely at home in a certain way that I had never felt growing up in Ohio. I ended up actually getting pregnant by a Korean monk, and of course this caused a lot of problems, and I left amidst great scandal and uproar. I arrived at a point in my life where my kid was old enough to do more things for himself. I had a little time for myself, and I actually went through a period of 4 days in which I remembered everything I felt from the period in which I had devoted myself to writing. It was as though a door had been unlocked, and all of the experience that I hadn't thought about or hadn't connected to directly for so many years just came flooding back to me. And with that came a sense of this forgotten or buried identity of myself as a writer who could come forward and begin to integrate the experience in basically silence and wordlessness, or experiences which were in another culture, the spiritual culture or the Korean culture, which were so hard to translate in any meaningful way into the everyday life of an American person.
I felt that it was easier to just go numb. But the minute such a thought would come into my head, I would say, no, I would never give up this. And this happens to be my life, and I've accepted it. And it's a struggle, but one of the greatest joys of this life that I've experienced is being totally engaged in writing a poem. When you first start writing your poetry, there is a kind of naivete, but that naivete is also very liberating, and it allows you to make all kinds of mistakes, because there's a sense also of a wonderful boundlessness and a feeling that you can do anything. By the time you're in your 30s, the personal responsibilities start creeping in and become, I think, a greater reality. And by the time you're 40s, I think there is a sense that life is finite, and with that there is a more of a spiritual urgency into the work. There is always a man walking down the road, a dog at his side, a man you saw when you were expecting to see the usual arrangement of trees. What becomes for you an eternal afternoon came out of the trees' involvement in the illusion brought in by the slow upheaval of mist. Uprooted, the trees seemed to float in the air that had turned to water. You had to begin another logic to understand the appearance of the man who began to make himself known to you. A man who by his faithful recurrence attaches himself to you, bringing the distance like a bone for you to examine or praise or throw out. You keep the bone, the hard vision of something elusive, as a man who began at a safe distance circles closer until he is the one who comes to fix the leak in your roof, positioning himself to exit and enter, unfettered by the cloud of your attention. You have difficulty hiding the bone that lies on the pillow beside your head. It shines and howls and breaks your dreams into pieces, like the pieces of the house you haul to the dump. Obstacles splinter, pierce through skin, like the firewood the man carries in his arms. He knows you are cold, and in his faithfulness, he will see to it that you have wood. He knows you know how to make a fire. This knowing agrees with you. He knows you do not know how to keep the fire from flaming out or burning beyond control. Coming and going toward each other becomes an act of single-heartedness, taken up by his nature to keep returning, to bring wood that you must split into kindling, the thinnest possible pencils of bone. The violence done to the heart of the wood is what builds your house.
You knew that when you first felt the ache he bore upon each nail, fastening down pieces of wood, that ache which builds an illusion.
In my poems, I struggle with the notion that I'm writing in English, which is a language I really love very deeply, at the same time as I must acknowledge that it is the language of the colonizers.
My poetry tells me that I'm not at home here, that I am not wanted, and that is the struggle of the people of the diaspora. We moved to the new nation, but we don't feel wanted, and it's that we write out of that rejection. The canary died in the gold mine. Her dreams got lost in the sieve. The canary died in the gold mine. Her dreams got lost in the sieve. Her husband, the crow, killed under the railroad. The spokes doth shorn his wings. Something's cooking in Chin's kitchen. 10,000 yellow-bellied sapsuckers baked in a pie. Something's cooking in Chin's kitchen. 10,000 yellow-bellied sapsuckers baked in a pie. Something's cooking in Chin's kitchen. Die, die, yellow bird, die, die. Oh, crack an egg on the griddle. Yellow will ooze into white. Oh, crack an egg on the griddle. Yellow will ooze into white. Run, run, sweet little Puritan. Yellow will ooze into white. If you cut my yellow wrists, I'll teach my yellow toes to write. If you cut my yellow wrists, I'll teach my yellow toes to write. If you cut my yellow fists, I'll teach my yellow feet to fight. Do not be afraid to perish, my mother. Buddha's compassion is nigh. Do not be afraid to perish, my mother. Our boat will sail tonight. Your babies will reach the promised land. The stars will be their guide. I am so mellow yellow, Buddha sings in my veins. I am so mellow yellow, Buddha sings in my veins. Oh, take me to the land of the unreborn. There's no life on earth without pain.
I had just read in the New York Times about the one-child policy in China and how the one-child policy has problematically, in fact, led to an incidence in female infanticide. And I was just outraged by this article. And I was so angry I wanted to write a poem out of it. But you know, it's hard to write a poem out of anger because what can you do? You will have to say, ah, and that's not a poem. So I decided to discipline my anger, and I picked a form known as the pantun. The pantun is a highly braided form where you repeat the first and third line of the stanza as the second and fourth line of the next stanza, and the braiding just keeps going, and it's a way I thought to control my anger. At present, the phenomena of butchering, drowning, and leaving to die female infants have been very serious. They say a child with two mouths is no good. In the slippery wet, a hollow space, smooth, gumming, echoing wide for food. No wonder my man is not here at his place. In the slippery wet, a hollow space, a slit narrowly sheathed within its hood. No wonder my man is not here at his place. He is digging for the dragon jar of soot. That slit, narrowly sheathed within its hood, his mother, squatting, coughs by the fire's blaze while he digs for the dragon jar of soot. We had saved ashes for 100 days.
The light, soft as late afternoon sun filtered through a screen door, draws you in to the three girls centered in the upper part of the frame. The photograph is torn and faded, yet they demand your attention, lined up like stair steps, straight as soldiers, regal as princesses. The eldest, proud and impassive. The middle one, thoughtful and inquisitive. The littlest, the artist mother, a hint of defiance held firmly in the stubborn set of her mouth. Sepia-toned arms and knees peek out from crisp white cotton. Willful waves of hair are disciplined by supple fabric bows. Their features bear witness to history, maintain the integrity of their ancestry, African, Chinese, Jamaican. Savor this moment, captured in the blink of a mind's eye, an offering frozen in time like the totems framing the photograph. This is our heritage, a ritual meal, a feast for the spirit. My poem, The Sisters, was inspired by a photograph by the Jamaican artist Albert Chong. I don't really know a whole lot about my Jamaican heritage. I did not grow up in Jamaica, and my mother moved here to the States as a young adult. And I think my response to Albert's photograph and my writing of the poem, and also when I actually read the poem in public, all of it is a process of me trying to make that connection.
Some years ago, a feminist journal was doing a special issue on women and play, and they asked me to send them a poem, and I said, okay, I would. And then I looked through all my poems, but although I have a lot of poems about women, I didn't have any on women and play. And I began to think why this was the case. And it struck me that it was the case because when I was growing up in India, I didn't see very many grown women playing. They were busy working, they were busy taking care of other people in the family, nurturing others, helping others to play. And so I wanted to write a poem about a woman who plays, who gets a chance to play. And I wanted to write it for women all over the world who perhaps didn't get a chance to play as much as they would have liked.
Meadow of crabgrass, faded dandelions, querulous child voices. She takes from her son's disgruntled hands the spool of a kite that will not fly, pulls on the heavy string, ground glass rough, between her thumb and finger. Feels the kite, translucent purple square, rise in a resistant arc, flapping against the wind. Kicks off her chappals, tucks up her kurta so she can run with it, light flecking off her hair, as when she was sexless young. Up past the puff-cheeked clouds she follows it, her eyes slit smiling at the sun. She has forgotten her tugging children, their give me wails. She sprints backwards, sure-footed she cannot fall, connected to the air she is flying. The wind blows through her, takes her red dupatta, mark of marriage. And she laughs like a woman should never laugh. So the two widows on the park bench stare and huddle their white-veiled heads to gossip whisper. The children have fallen, breathless, in the grass behind. She laughs like wild water, shaking her braids loose. She laughs like a fire, the spool a blur between her hands, the string unraveling all the way to release it into space, her life, into its bright, weightless orbit.
I would hope what it means to be a poet in this particular culture is that you can complicate and in a sense, make propositions about the possibilities of the poem, the possibilities of how you use language.
I'm struggling terribly with this because it's forcing me to ask questions about, you know, even what I want to be. I mean, do I want to be just black? Or do I want to really explore the fullness of who I am in terms of being Asian too, you know?
I would be dead without my poetry. I wrote poetry to save my life. I needed it to save my life. And I needed it every day.
We're all engaged in this work of bringing something artistic out of the chaos and the banality of everyday life. In a certain way, it's always that question of how do we get poetry out of a culture in which the shopping mall is so important.
If we don't tell our stories, then someone else tells them from the outside, and then they often don't get it right. There are often prejudices and stereotypes. There are ways in which we're exoticized or minimized or marginalized, and I don't want that to happen.
I think of Walt Whitman's line, "I hear America singing," and I think that's basically what it is. I feel so lucky to be part of this multitude of voices that are singing across America, and to be grateful to be able to carry one line, one thread of that note.